I didn't think anything was wrong at the time. That's what scares me now. I've spent years deciding whether this was something worth writing down, not because it sounds unbelievable, but because it doesn't. There was no single moment where everything clearly went wrong, no event that would stand out if you told it quickly. What happened unfolded slowly, quietly, in a way that blended into everyday life so well that it became almost invisible. That's what made it dangerous. When you're a child, you don't have the ability to label unease or articulate the feeling that something is off. You depend on adults to notice, to react, to tell you when something matters, and when they don't, you internalize the idea that whatever you're feeling must be insignificant, even if your body is constantly tense, even if sleep stops feeling safe. Looking back now, that silence from the adults around me shaped the fear more than the events themselves ever did. I was 11 years old when my family moved into that house. It didn't look threatening in any obvious way. It wasn't old, it wasn't isolated, and it didn't have the kind of history people warn you about. It sat at the edge of a new suburban development where construction had stopped halfway through, leaving empty lots and unfinished streets that felt oddly temporary, like the neighborhood hadn't settled into itself yet. During the day, everything seemed normal. Kids rode bikes, parents mowed lawns, and nothing felt out of place. But at night, the area changed. The usual background noise of the world disappeared completely. No distant traffic, no sirens, no voices drifting through open windows. Just a thick, unnatural quiet that made the house feel cut off from everything else. Even before anything happened, that silence made it harder to relax, like the absence of sound itself was something you were supposed to notice. My bedroom was at the very end of a long, narrow hallway, separated from the rest of the house in a way I initially liked. It felt private, removed, like a small space that belonged entirely to me. During the day, the hallway was unremarkable, just a stretch of floor connecting rooms. But at night, it changed in ways that are hard to explain without having experienced it yourself. The darkness seemed thicker there, and sounds behaved differently, lingering longer than they should have, bouncing in ways that made it difficult to judge distance. The hallway felt longer at night, as if the space itself stretched once the lights were off. I didn't think of it as fear at the time. It was more a sense of awareness, like my body was paying attention to something my mind hadn't caught up to yet. The first night it happened, I didn't drift awake slowly. My eyes opened all at once, as if a switch had been flipped inside my head. For a moment, I didn't know where I was. The room was completely dark, the kind of darkness where shapes lose their meaning. Then I became aware of how still everything felt. No distant sounds, no movement, just silence pressing in from all sides. The digital clock on my nightstand glowed faintly, showing a little after 3 a.m. I remember feeling confused more than scared, trying to understand why I was suddenly awake. That's when I noticed the sound, not loud enough to startle me, but present enough that I couldn't ignore it. It felt like something had shifted somewhere else in the house, not abruptly, but carefully, as if whatever caused it was trying not to be noticed. At first, I thought it must have been someone else in the house. That explanation felt safe, familiar. I told myself it was probably my father getting up to use the bathroom or my mother moving around quietly. But the sound didn't match that idea. It wasn't footsteps. There was no rhythm, no pause between steps, no sense of forward motion. Instead, it sounded like weight being applied to the floor and then slowly redistributed, as if something heavy was adjusting its position rather than walking. The floorboards responded in a way I had never heard during the day, creaking under steady pressure instead of quick movement. The longer I listened, the harder it became to convince myself this was normal. The sound came from the hallway, far enough away that I couldn't pinpoint it exactly, but close enough that it felt connected to my room. I lay completely still, afraid that even the smallest movement might somehow make things worse. My breathing felt too loud in the silence, so I tried to slow it, focusing on staying as quiet as possible. After what felt like a long time, the sound stopped. Not abruptly, there was no clear end to it. It simply faded, as if the pressure had been lifted, and whatever caused it had decided it was finished. I waited, expecting to hear something else follow. Footsteps, a door opening, any kind of explanation, but nothing did. Eventually, exhaustion pulled me back into sleep, though it didn't feel restful. The next morning, the memory already felt distant, like something half imagined. In the light of day, the house looked completely ordinary. The hallway was just a hallway again. At breakfast, I mentioned the noise casually, careful not to sound scared. My mother barely reacted, saying it was probably just the house settling. My father didn't even look up from his coffee. No one asked what it sounded like or where it came from. No one suggested checking the hallway. The conversation moved on immediately, and I learned without anyone saying it outright that this wasn't something worth paying attention to. 2 nights later, it happened again. Same time, same sound. This time, I didn't fall back asleep afterward. I lay there replaying it in my head, trying to find differences, trying to convince myself it still fit the explanation I'd been given. But something felt wrong. The silence that followed felt heavier than the noise itself, as if the sound had been part of a process that hadn't fully finished. My heart was beating faster than it should have been, and I couldn't relax no matter how much I told myself I was overreacting. Over the next week, the sound became a pattern. It only happened after everyone else was asleep, always between 3 and 4 in the morning, and always from the hallway. At first, it stayed far away near the living room where the hallway widened slightly. I told myself that was why it sounded different there. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, the distance began to change. One night, it stopped a little closer. Another night, closer still. It never jumped suddenly from one place to another. It moved in increments small enough that I could almost deny they were happening at all. I didn't consciously measure the distance at first. I just felt it. The sound felt nearer, heavier, more present. I started waking up before it happened, my body tense and alert without any clear reason. Sometimes I would lie awake for minutes, waiting in the silence before the sound finally began. Other times it started almost immediately, as if my waking had triggered it. That idea lodged itself in my mind and refused to leave. The thought that something might be aware of me, not watching, not listening, but responding, made it impossible to relax. As the nights passed, I became aware of how much of my attention was now focused on the hallway. During the day, I caught myself glancing toward it without thinking, as if expecting to notice something out of place. At night, it felt impossible to think about anything else. The sound no longer surprised me. Instead, I waited for it with a sense of dread that settled in my stomach long before bedtime. I started associating certain moments with its arrival. The way the house felt once all the lights were off, the specific quiet that came after my parents' bedroom door closed, the faint hum of electricity that seemed louder in the absence of everything else. It was like my body had learned the rhythm of the house and knew exactly when it would break. Eventually, the sound reached the middle of the hallway. I remember that night clearly because it stayed there longer than it ever had before. The floorboards creaked under a steady, unmoving pressure, and for the first time, it didn't immediately continue toward the bathroom. It just paused, as if something had stopped to consider where it was. I lay there staring at the outline of my door, trying to slow my breathing, trying not to imagine what might be causing it. The silence between each faint creak felt stretched, unnatural, like the house itself was waiting for something to happen. That was when I started counting time differently. Seconds felt longer, minutes blurred together. I couldn't tell how long the sound stayed there, only that it was long enough for my thoughts to spiral. I wondered if my parents could hear it from their room. I wondered if they were awake, listening, choosing not to say anything. That thought scared me more than the sound itself. The idea that someone else might know it was happening and still ignore it made the house feel less safe, not just because of whatever was moving through it, but because of the silence that surrounded it. When the sound finally moved again, it didn't retreat. It continued forward, closer to my end of the hallway. I felt my chest tighten as the creaking shifted, the pressure transferring from one section of floor to the next. It was slow and deliberate, never rushed, never uncertain. I realized then that it wasn't wandering, it wasn't random. It was following the same path it always had, just extending it a little further each night. That understanding brought a new kind of fear, one rooted not in the unknown, but in the growing certainty of what would come next. Too consistent, too controlled, too aware, too consistent, too controlled, too aware of the space it occupied. I started keeping my door closed tightly, even during the day, as if that might somehow make a difference. At night, I lay in bed listening, knowing that sooner or later it would reach the end of the hallway, knowing that when it did, there would be nowhere else for it to go. From that night on, I stopped pretending it was just the house. I didn't have a better explanation, but the old one no longer worked. The sound was too consistent, too controlled, too aware of the space it occupied. I started keeping my door closed tightly even during the day. At night, I lay in bed listening, knowing that sooner or later it would reach the end of the hallway, knowing that when it did, there would be nowhere else for it to go. The night it finally reached my door, I woke up before the sound began. There was a tightness in my chest that felt different from the nights before. The house was silent in a strained, unnatural way, as if it were holding something in place. When the sound started, it was already close. Not moving, just present. The floorboards outside my room creaked under a steady pressure that didn't shift or sway. Whatever had been moving through the hallway had stopped, and it felt as though it had arrived exactly where it intended to be. I stared at my door, at the thin line of darkness beneath it, convinced that if I looked away, something would change. Time stopped behaving normally. I couldn't tell how long it stayed there. My thoughts broke apart into fragments. I wondered if it was standing there, or leaning against the door, or simply waiting. There was no sound of breathing, no movement, just the unmistakable sense of presence that made my body feel locked in place. At some point, I realized I was holding my breath. The air in my room felt thick and stale, as if it hadn't moved in a long time. I forced myself to inhale slowly, terrified that even the smallest sound might give me away. My eyes stayed fixed on the door handle. It never moved, but I couldn't stop expecting it to. The fear wasn't sudden or explosive. It was quiet and heavy, settling into my muscles and making movement feel impossible. Eventually, the pressure began to ease. The floorboards stopped creaking, not all at once, but gradually, as if the weight had been carefully lifted. The sound moved again, continuing down the hallway toward the bathroom. I didn't feel relief when it left. I felt exposed, as if something had learned exactly where I was and no longer needed to search. I stayed awake until morning. When daylight finally came, I opened my door and checked the hallway. Everything looked exactly the same as it always had. No marks, no damage, no explanation. That normality felt wrong, almost mocking. Standing there, I understood that asking my parents about it again would change nothing. Whatever was happening at night wasn't something anyone else was willing to notice. After that night, I started keeping my door closed at all times. During the day, it felt unnecessary, even a little childish, but at night it became a ritual. Closing it felt like drawing a thin line between me and the hallway, even though I knew it wasn't a real barrier. Sleep became fragmented. I drifted in and out of shallow rest, waking at the smallest sound, my body tense long before my mind caught up. I began to feel tired in a way that didn't go away with rest, as if my body never fully powered down anymore. A few nights later, I noticed something else. The hallway smelled different at night, not strong, not obviously bad, just stale, like air that had been trapped somewhere too long and finally released. During the day, the smell was gone. I tried convincing myself it was my imagination, a side effect of being tired, but once I noticed it, I couldn't ignore it. Every night around the same time, the air outside my door felt heavier, thicker, as if the hallway itself was changing. Small things in the house started to feel off. The bathroom light was sometimes on in the morning, even though no one admitted to using it. Doors that were always kept closed were slightly open. Nothing dramatic, nothing that could be pointed to as proof. just enough to make me doubt my own memory. I stopped trusting my sense of what was normal. I started second guessing myself constantly, wondering if I had imagined closing a door or turning off a light, wondering if I was the one making mistakes. By then, I wasn't just afraid of the hallway. I was afraid of the idea that the house was adjusting. It felt as though whatever moved through it at night had learned the layout, learned the routines, learned where everyone slept. The thought that it had stopped at my door, not out of curiosity, but out of certainty, settled deep in my chest. I realized I was no longer waiting to hear the sound. I was waiting for what would come after it stopped. That was the moment I understood something had changed. I wasn't waiting for the sound anymore. I was waiting for what would happen after it stopped.